Okay. So we understand how busy secondary school students are with their various commitments and how their attention is focused on a wide range of areas in their lives. This workshop will highlight how to incorporate regular reading into their lives and finding the perfect book to match their interests. Becky, some of you will also know, is the Education Outreach Manager at Children's Books Ireland. She holds a BA in English Studies, an MPhil in Children's Literature, and a doctorate in Irish Children's Literature from Trinity College Dublin. She's worked with Children's Books Ireland in various capacities, including as a book doctor since 2016, and has a background in youth facilitation and outreach work. She also lectures in children's literature in Trinity College Dublin. So thank you very much, Becky, for joining us today and leading on this. I'm going to hand over to you now and put myself on mute.
Thank you, Aoife. And every time Aoife does that particular intro, I just realised that we could sum it up in I love children's books a lot. And I'm very lucky to get to work with them and with children and young people as well. As Aoife was saying, this session is really aimed at supporting, as it says in the title, struggling and reluctant readers in secondary school, and I suppose to make reading just a normal part of their lives, not something that they maybe have to remind themselves to do, just something that can hopefully organically be part of their routine. Now, struggling and reluctant readers are probably two different things. To my mind, at least, myself and Aoife have chatted about this. The reluctant readers are more the readers who are very, very capable readers in terms of skills and in terms of literacy, who maybe just have that issue of trying to find the right book, or maybe just to find time in their busy lives and to actually get a bit of reading in. And I suppose struggling readers, to my mind and from my experience, is more along the lines of readers who are maybe reading potentially at a lower level than their peers or their age group. They might be living with a diagnosis of dyslexia or other different learning abilities or experiences. And I suppose this session is really, I'm going to touch on supporting dyslexic readers and just give some resources and tips around that, but it's really more focusing on supporting readers to figure out a way to incorporate reading into their lives, essentially. So the dyslexia piece is huge, and I know the teachers support students in so many different ways in that context, particularly in terms of getting assessments and that kind of thing. So hopefully we'll touch on both, but I would say this session is really more aimed at those kind of reluctant readers and hopefully getting some interesting reading sort of ideas and routines going, both in school and maybe hopefully kind of bleeding into home life as well, which would be the aim. So what makes a reluctant reader? I suppose this is not a hard and fast rule. It's not even down to sort of research or academic work. It's literally just our experience as a charity that work with children and young people, and from my own background as well. And it seems to be that these themes come up a lot when we interact with children and young people about books and about getting books into their lives. And that community piece is that sometimes reading can be quite a solitary pursuit. And that's what I love about it. But sometimes readers need that sense of support or being part of a group that also think that reading is cool, and sort of thinking reading is cool is, potentially a bit of an issue depending on the friend groups they might have formed or that kind of thing. The interest piece, it's interested, but also motivation, that you can love, love, love reading, but maybe might not pick up a book from one end of the week to the other, or you don't know that you love reading. So there's sort of two sides to that equation. And then again, time, an awful lot of students in secondary school, like their teachers and their grown-ups at home, are time poor. And I suppose it's about getting creative in terms of, that idea of drop everything and read sort of for 10 minutes, 5 minutes, and that kind of helping students to see that you don't have to spend hours and hours reading for it to count, if that makes sense. Only a couple of minutes a day can really make a difference, not just to their sort of their literacy or, even their vocabulary, their writing, their expression, whatever, those sort of school skills, for want of a better phrase, but also for their well-being too. And it can be really interesting to see the kind of uptick that students can experience if they do actually attempt to make time for reading in their lives. So that idea of time, and these are just again from our experience working with children and young people in schools and in different settings, these are the times that we can tap into and to help them make reading a sort of, as I said, an organic part of their routines. So some students commute to school, and it might be a case of that they're waiting for a school bus. That could be half an hour, 40 minutes. And then, that actual time on the bus itself, why not pack a book in their school bags? Break times obviously are the obvious thing, and hopefully they're not, cramming for a test that they should have revised for, the week before, or trying to finish homework or that kind of thing. But dipping into a book at break times can be a really lovely way to just sort of center themselves maybe and take time for themselves, because school it's hectic. It's chaotic. There's always a lot going on. I suppose if your school offers a breakfast club before school, or even activities afterwards, there can also be sort of free time, or I don't mean dead time, because that's very pejorative way of looking at it, but just time that is sort of lacking in terms of what students see they can do with it, if that makes sense. And again, waiting for the bus and the lifts home as well before and after school study. School study can be a really lovely time for students to get classwork done, get the homework done, and maybe studying is something they do at home. But why not have a book for study as well? Because really, reading and studying are almost the same thing to my mind. Not that you want to tell students that, because that would immediately turn them off, but always encouraging students to have a book in their bag can really allow them to tap into this sort of, it's not free time, but it's time that's just floating, time that can be really used to build up a kind of a repertoire of reading. And again, it depends on the individual teacher, obviously, and on the individual subject. The free time when they've done whatever they're supposed to do in class, if you can encourage a culture of that in your subject and in your particular class, and helping students to see that if they've finished a particular task in geography, taking out a book and reading is actually going to help them in their next geography lesson as well, because that idea of holistic reading, almost, even if they're reading a fantasy book that has nothing to do with geography, the language they're picking up, the expression, the sort of the narrative tropes that they're engaging with are really going to help them express themselves when it comes to writing a paragraph for a geography test, or potentially for the junior cert or the leaving cert, depending on what stage they're at in their educational journey. So again, it's that fine line between making reading fun and allowing them to see the value of it as well. Because I know everyone has that student in mind who is so committed to studying, works so hard, gets, amazing grades all the time, and sort of encouraging them to allow themselves to read, almost maybe helping them to see the school benefits or the subject benefits from that, can be really empowering as well. Sorry, in terms of interest, this is really the school culture idea. And I suppose almost, which sounds a little bit creepy, it's kind of the subliminal sort of encouragement of reading, or helping them see how reading is really a part of everyday life in school already. Um, if certainly this is something that happens a lot in primary school, I know, and it was certainly one of the most valuable things that I remember from my time in primary school. Being read to by a teacher can be such a wonderful experience, because it's almost as though students get the chance to take a weight off themselves. They can relax. They can just sort of, immerse themselves in the story and use their imaginations. And I think reconnecting with that younger, positive experience of reading as well can actually be really, really lovely, and can help them realize that, oh, reading actually has a place in my life now. We all get to that stage, where we're like, oh, we're almost too old for reading. And particularly in sort of secondary school, after the transition from primary, and when there's the exam focus and extracurriculars, just that sense of, reading is a lovely thing to do for me as well. And being read to just has such positive associations. Now, depending on who controls the intercom in your school, this may or may not be possible, but poetry over the intercom can be a really lovely way to just, again, get poetry and get reading into the school environment, or even reading out a short story at assembly. Now, that could be obviously a literary short story, but it could potentially be a chance to set up a competition, that students could contribute their own work, and that it could become a real tradition potentially in the school. And again, having illustrated books, just sort of not even necessarily in the school library, if your school is actually, I won't say lucky enough, but if your school actually has a school library, maybe moving books outside of the library and leaving them on windowsills where they're easily accessible, and students can just pick them up and leave them down, almost like the bike share scheme, that you would just leave a book on a windowsill, maybe replace it once you've read it, that kind of thing. And I suppose talking about the different kinds of books that are available, like, do your students know what verse novels are? That verse novels are not just pages and pages of, poetry that isn't connected. Verse novels are actually a story in poetic form, And they can be really, really accessible, like that Accessible Reads bubble says, to students maybe who are a bit overwhelmed by the longer books, or who maybe just have a flair for poetry as well. So it can work, as I say, on both sides of the equation. Making sure that short books are available as well, because again, that sense of a massive tome can be really, really, sort of enticing or motivating to some students who like a challenge and who love to really throw themselves into longer novels. But short books and having them available and visible and sort of promoted almost can be really good for students who think, I do like reading, but I just can't commit to that longer book. And I know it's going to take too much out of me. Maybe even novel extracts at the end of the week. There was a lovely anecdote that I heard from a teacher that they would always, at the end of a class, on a Friday, particularly because everybody's in that Friday feeling mode, that they would share what they're reading or what they're planning to read over the weekend. And potentially that's not even a book. It could be that they're planning to get the Saturday papers because there's something interesting in the ticket in the Irish Times or anything at all that sort of promotes that idea of reading. So the teacher would share what she was reading, read out a chapter, maybe encourage her students to read along with her to see what they would think of it. And again, that sort of community piece as well. But just having that sort of end of the week, the weekend is your time, you could get a bit of reading in, and it might actually make a real difference to your mood and to set yourself up for the following week then as well. Yeah. And then community, again, like I was saying, the solitary sort of nature of reading really appeals to me, and it's sort of my, my escapism time, my kind of wind down. It's a very individual thing. But again, for some students, like that lovely picture there, for some students, they really get a kick out of being able to talk to their peers about books. And potentially that's not something that they realize they can do. I know it sounds a bit strange, but that idea of sort of almost structured play dates or structured reading dates, that is essentially a book club, yes. But that sometimes students don't make the connection with reading and their outside lives. And that's where school can really, really help, because if school is the place that they associate with reading, why not bring in some of those lovely sort of community and almost fun friendship-based things into school as well? So setting up a book club in your class or in your school could be a really interesting way to draw in, particularly students who are maybe that bit shyer and would benefit for having that sort of discussion forum. If you have a school website, or even a Twitter page, any sort of social media or whatever, asking students to write reviews about their favorite books or even books that they didn't like. Again, it's a really lovely way of getting student voice and associating that with reading in the school as well. And again, it's talking about almost like a competition for short stories, but why not a creative writing group, particularly for those students who have that kind of flair for arts, who are maybe involved in drama in the school as well, and just helping them realize that there are lots of different outlets for creativity as well. If you don't have a reading committee in your school, this could be a really interesting thing to set up, almost like a student council, that this would be a group of students who are passionate about reading, or maybe who aren't and would like to be, and that it would be their job almost to promote reading throughout the school and to come up with those kind of innovative ways of getting reading into the school culture. Now, a podcast might be a little bit beyond the resources of the school, but you never know. It's really, really simple thing to set up. And again, if it's student led, that gives them agency and sort of investment in what they're doing. And again, we touched on social media, and I suppose tapping into where students already are at. If you notice that your students are spending a lot of time on the phone, aren't we all? Why not harness that a little bit and talk to them about book talk and talk to them about books on Instagram, which is again a ready-made community that they can be a part of. And I suppose it's a more wholesome way maybe to spend time on social media than just randomly scrolling and watching TikTok videos or whatever. They can get a lot of inspiration, but they can also get a sense of what other people their age are reading too. And if it's within your power, that idea of organizing visits to book events. I mean, not just the library, but you'll find that your local library is the site for an awful lot of this type of thing. If there's a book launch on in your town, why not see if students want to go along? If there are festivals within reach, there will usually be some kind of literary element, particularly if it's a family orientated festival. And workshops. Again, your local library will be a real source of information about these types of things as well. And I think an awful lot of people don't realize that if something isn't happening in your community, if there aren't any, say, creative writing workshops for teenagers happening in your community already, maybe talk to your librarian, because they will know who to go to set something like that up, or potentially they might have the skill set themselves to do it. So if they think that there's a demand for that kind of thing in the community, they will really try and rise to the challenge. So chat to your local librarian. You'd be amazed what might be going on. And again, like I say, phones. I think it's easy to kind of be negative about phones, and to, there's an awful lot of talk of banning phones in schools. But until that happens, this is where teenagers are at. And again, it can be a far more wholesome way of engaging with social media if that's what your students are doing already, and turning it into a way to potentially talk about social media as a concept, and maybe to help them move away from it and more into reading, more into that sort of community-based sharing of experiences almost, because that's essentially what books are. They're a way to share experiences and to build empathy. Um, and ebooks and audiobooks are a huge thing as well, and they're becoming more so. I suppose with ebooks especially, it means we can access a tremendous amount of books at a much reduced cost, because let's be honest, books are expensive. And if you know that a student has maybe a home where just books are not on the cards because their parents or their guardians are attempting to pay the electricity bill. I mean, fair. It's about making books accessible in whatever format your students are more comfortable with. So I mean, reading on the phone is still reading to my mind. And if students can access ebooks there, why not? And particularly say for those students again who maybe struggle with their literacy skills, again, who might be dyslexic, or maybe who just don't have the concentration span for a long book, why not talk to them about audiobooks? Because if you can come across an audiobook who has a great narrator, you'd be amazed that an awful lot of students, an awful lot of young people will think, oh, I'd actually love to read that myself now that I've listened to it, because they're two such different experiences. So again, sort of technology, I suppose, can potentially be the way to go to really build that culture of reading in the school and for students as well. Um, Book tasting. So some of you might have come across this website before. Now it's very it's very over the top, head over heels for teaching. I think the tagline is just like shoes, you can never have enough classroom resources or something like that. So it can look a bit sort of bombastic when you first log onto it, but it really is full of great ideas. And I've literally, hands up, I've literally lifted this off that website. So this idea of book tasting is that particularly maybe around even around CBAs and for juniors, so you could turn this into something that or project-based learning, you could turn this into something that students really take on board themselves, or even for something like Culture Week, if that's something that your school does, to bring together as many books as possible. And they don't have to be new books. They really, really don't. They can be just books sort of taken from the school library, donations from parents, but that you almost set it up like a tasting menu in a restaurant, and students maybe get 5 books at their table, they look at them, they decide from the cover, maybe they like it, maybe they don't, and they rate the books essentially and decide which one they would like to take for their meal. That's kind of how the metaphor goes. So it can be a great way to introduce students to, yes, new cultures, because of course we can learn about new cultures through narrative, but also different types of genres that maybe, they've gotten stuck into a particular, say, fantasy rut, or they only read sports books. And that's not a bad thing. Maybe they're missing out on other types of books that they just wouldn't engage with unless they're put in front of them, if that makes sense. So yeah, I really would recommend that Head Over Heels for Teaching website. Like I say, it can be a little bit over the top, but the actual resources are very, very practical and really usable as well. Um, Within sort of the classroom setting, that idea of walking debates, and I mean, this is something that obviously you can use for sort of curriculum-based texts as well, or for class novels, depending on what kind of what level of what age group of students you're working with. So the walking debates are great, and I mean, not just for books, for all sorts of different concepts. And I'm sure you know exactly how walking debates work, that you have, a group of students in the middle of the room and disagree is to the right and agree is to the left, depending on what you're actually talking about. So this is just a flavor of what you can do in terms of a wide range of books. This character is right in their decision to do, agree, disagree. Why? What would you have done in their stead? I enjoyed the author's writing style. And if everybody ends up in the disagree side of the room, you've got a really interesting conversation starting then. And it's also teaching them kind of to have an opinion, but not just that, to be able to back themselves up. And again, that sort of classic exam line of, with reference to the text. And it really does get students engaged in the books that they're reading, that it's that reflective and critical thinking piece as well. And I suppose the main takeaway from this story is, and ideally you would have a huge range, like, sort of students across the whole room, the spectrum of agreeing or disagreeing. And that can be a really interesting way, like I say, to open up conversations about a particular book, sometimes particularly about classic books. And again, that's the sort of the curriculum side of things as well, that potentially students might initially think a certain way, but having a conversation with their peers and coming at it from different angles and different perspectives could actually change what they think about the book. So it can also be a really interesting way to see how they develop in terms of their response to a particular text. The fan fiction piece is great. Now, the term fan fiction, I don't think existed when I was doing all of this stuff when I was a teenager. But, really asking your students to sort of pick apart a particular book, figure out why they like it, figure out why they don't, but then to actually be creative about it as well. Like, example, rewrite the opening scene or create a new scenario for two of your favorite characters or for your least favorite character. Write the villain's backstory, all of this type of thing. Write an email or a letter to the author, really get them to talk about what they liked about the book, what they would change. And again, up at the top, draw a comic or an illustration of their favorite scene. So again, it's opening up what we traditionally think of as reading. It's really getting them to think around the book and bringing the book into their world, if that makes sense. Redesigning the book cover. And again, these can all be sort of not necessarily competitions, but they can be things that that students can display around the school as well, if it's a particularly sort of productive and creative session. And that sort of write a diary entry again, that's sort of tapping into exam language as well. And that's not necessarily what we want students to associate reading with, but it all helps. It all, ups their level of written communication and of oral expression as well, and their ability to really get their thoughts down on paper, just hopefully in fun and creative ways. So I suppose this slide is kind of aimed at the students themselves. And I think helping them to build good reading habits is something that will hopefully maybe start in school and then hopefully move out into the world outside school, at home and even amongst their peers as well. And again, it's that sense of choosing the time wisely and spending their time wisely. And again, I suppose that idea of changing up the genre and realizing that there's more than one way to enjoy a book. Again, that's an audiobook, that's watching the film adaptation, which we'll talk about a little bit in a minute. Finding creative ways to engage with books that goes beyond, as I say, the traditional, just sort of sit down and stick your head in the book. And I think encouraging students to be patient as well. I don't know about you, but when I was younger, the thought of giving up on a book was just anathema to me. I had to finish it, even if it was awful, even if I hated it, even if it was boring. But as a grown up, I've realized that life is just too short for books that you're not interested in or for books that you find boring. So, really encouraging students to make decisions about their reading as well. And that if they pick up a book and it doesn't grab them within a couple of chapters, pick another book. It's really that simple because, again, life is too short for bad books. And there are so many good books out there, particularly for young people. And I think the quality of what's being produced, particularly in Ireland today, but also around the world for young people, is just phenomenal. And they deserve to be able to access those. So this is a quick sort of touch on, again, supporting readers who maybe students, readers who are living with dyslexia, or maybe that you suspect might have a diagnosis of dyslexia, but potentially haven't been assessed yet. Barrington Stoke are a UK publisher, and I will just sing their praises wherever I go. They're a wonderful publisher in that they focus specifically on producing books for readers who are living with dyslexia, and they do that in an awful lot of different ways. The way they physically produce books is quite different to the traditional type of book production. The type of paper they use, the color of the paper, the fonts they choose, these are all done with the dyslexic reader in mind and making sure that the physical act of reading a book is as simple and as easy and as accessible for them as possible. So you will see in Barrington Stoke books, first of all, they're usually quite short. The text is usually has more space between it than in traditional books. And like I say, even the color of the page is geared towards helping readers take hold of a book and really get stuck into it, because an awful lot of dyslexic readers will experience sort of words jumping on a page, or not being able to read certain colors. All of that is factored into the way that Barrington Stoke produce their books, which is phenomenal. So The One in the Middle, Animal Farm, is obviously a classic by George Orwell, but the super readable edition that Barrington Stoke have put together, it simplifies some of the language, yes, and because there are different reading ages and different reading levels. It's that idea of, high-low, that it's high content, interesting content, but maybe lower on the reading age, just to make it easier for dyslexic readers to really get engaged with books. So they have an awful lot of sort of classic texts available, that will make it easier for readers who are living with that diagnosis to read through. But they also have something like, say, The Starlight Watchmaker by Lauren James, which is completely original. So they work with very established and just very good and very conscientious children's and young adult authors to produce bespoke books almost. And that emphasis is on engaging stories. Because again, if you are living with a diagnosis of dyslexia, you already find reading hard. So if you encounter a boring book, I mean, there's no way you're going to keep going with that. So the books that Barrington Stoke publish are really aimed at grabbing readers from the get-go, if that makes sense. So the great thing about their website is, as you can see from the different tabs, you can log on as, say, a parent or a carer or a guardian or a teacher or a librarian, and really sort of get stuck into how the website can work for you. So there's a whole range of resources for teachers, and it's across the board, both primary and secondary. And basically how you would go about choosing, again, the right books for your pupils. The reading ages, as it says here, it goes from 6 to 8 plus, and then also for higher level as well, sort of young adult age. And the interest age is from 3 plus to teen. So you can download samples of particular text depending on the reading age that are available on the website, potentially work with your students or the students that you have in mind who you think would benefit from Barrington Stoke books. And then you will know the specific sort of reading age and interest age that you're working with. Now, libraries are really, really getting on board with Barrington Stoke books. It depending on the library, you might find them like prominently on display, and you could have a sign that would say, dyslexia friendly books. There's a bit of a debate about, whether that's off-putting to readers who are living with dyslexia or not, or whether it makes the books accessible. But regardless, have a chat again to your local librarian. I always end up giving librarians lots of work to do on this, and just talk to them about what's available in your library and what they can potentially get in for you. But they really are a fantastic resource for students who, just because they're already living with dyslexia, they deserve that extra helping hand to find the books that are good for them. Now, and this is a sort of, I suppose, the kind of the meat of the session. That's a very strange way to put it, but these are sort of the book recommendations, and hopefully with these sort of representative samples of different genres and different kind of concepts, you'll be able to sort of apply this kind of thinking to other book selections, and potentially if you're looking to maybe restock in your library or that kind of thing, just to give you a sense of what's out there, I suppose. So this is kind of the classic sort of film tie-in, if that makes sense. So if particularly teenage students potentially see things on Netflix, they might not know that they originally came from a book. And what I love about film tie-ins is that you have the comparison piece. And again, I keep doing this and I don't mean to, that taps into the language of the exam as well, obviously, particularly the English exam, where you're comparing and contrasting different media, which is really, really cool. And the great thing is, well, I won't say the great thing, usually, particularly with sort of younger age books, the film adaptations are normally not great. I remember being extremely excited for The Dark is Rising by Susan Cooper to be adapted into a film, and it was awful. But I love telling readers this, that they can watch an awful version in the cinema and yet have a fantastic book to go back to and to be sort of happy that it exists almost. Now, Heartstopper by Alice Oseman, I'm sure everyone's heard of this. It's kind of it's a multi-series now at this stage, and thankfully the TV adaptation has been very successful. So it's a lovely LGBTQ plus story, a boy meets boy. The novels themselves they're very warm, they're very accessible, the language is so lovely, and as I say, the Netflix adaptation has been really successful. So there's a lovely piece there of students realizing that stories live in different forms and that books do a different thing to a TV or a film adaptation. And why is that? You know, why is a book so different and yet can be translated into a completely different medium, which is interesting. Everything is by Nicola Yoon. That's a fantastic adaptation as well. And of course, everyone has come across Suzanne Collins and the Hunger Games. Again, depending on who you ask, the success or not of the cinema adaptations is potentially up for grabs. One of Us is Lying by Karen M. McManus. This sort of like thriller, mystery, murder mystery genre for young adults is huge. And Karen M. McManus, like, you know, she sort of seems to produce a book at least a year. She's kind of like the Agatha Christie for young adults these days. So those are always really, really popular, very readable, and also sort of suspenseful and thrilling and engaging as well. A Monster Calls by Patrick Ness, again, another cinema adaptation as well, and quite a different one potentially from the others that are here. Very serious, very sort of emotionally mature, but hopefully relatable as well. And of course, something like The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas was incredibly relevant during the Black Lives Matter protests. It's that sense of somebody really trying to stand up for what she knows is right, but against a real sort of community of, as with being isolated from her community, really. So I suppose these are kind of teachable books as well. Depending on what stage you're at with your students and what you want to cover in the curriculum as well, would very much recommend The Hate You Give. And of course, I have Pride and Prejudice there by Jane Austen, because of course it's a classic, but also there are obviously the BBC, the infamous BBC adaptation, and at least 2 film adaptations, if not 3 or 4, that your students can actually watch, compare, see how one was adapted. Obviously there was the one in the 90s with Emma Thompson, and then in the 2000s with Keira Knightley. So you can see what different generations of film producers, directors pull out of the original text, and you can see how much it's changed and how the themes speak to us now as opposed to in Jane Austen's time in the 1800s. So there's so much there that can really, as I say, feed into the classroom, but also hopefully into reading at home as well, potentially, and on the school bus. So these are sort of LGBTQI plus books, which are, and there's so many. Even just in the last 5 years, potentially, I would have struggled to fill this slide. And like there were so many more that I could have put on here, which is just fantastic. The Henna Wars by Adiba Jaigirdar. Adiba Jaigirdar is a Bangladeshi Irish author, and she is fabulous. Again, seems to produce books at a rate of knots. And this sort of idea of representation and inclusivity, Adiba speaks to this really, really well, in that she just writes the books that she wants to write. She doesn't see herself as particularly representing her culture, but obviously she writes what she knows. So that leads then to a beautiful representation of how she feels, to be a Bangladeshi Irish author, which I think is gorgeous. C.G. Moore's Gut Feelings as well, that deals with chronic illness too. So there's an awful lot of crossover. I know I've sort of branded these as LGBTQI plus books, but they bring in so much more as well. And I think it's really important to encourage students to read around their own experience as well. That idea of the difference between looking in a mirror and looking in a window really comes to bear with books like these. The Black Flamingo is a fabulous verse novel, but it's also kind of a graphic novel as well. And of course, it deals with the idea of growing up in a different culture, of familial strife. There's so much there, and it's a really, really rich text as well. And for some of these texts, we have resources on the Children's Book Ireland website. I actually meant to pop a slide in for that. But if you go onto our website, childrensbooksireland.ie, there is a tab for school resources, and you'll find sort of worksheets, activities, that kind of thing. Specifically for some of these texts, definitely the Black Flamingo is there. Sports books. So I suppose this is the idea of kind of tapping into interests that are already there. Now, I'm not saying that every student who plays GAA or plays basketball is going to love to read about basketball or GAA, but why not start a conversation like that? If you like basketball, why not read The Crossover by Kwame Alexander? Just because it's a fantastic book, but he also writes really authentically about his experience of being an athlete. And, the characters in these books, that's where their authenticity and their relatability comes from. Louisa Reed's Gloves Off is actually a story about a young girl, coping with an experience of being bullied, and finding that boxing and self-defense is actually a really empowering way for her to sort of consolidate her own identity and finding purpose in physical activity, in boxing, in something that she can really get good at, which I think is really important, especially for a novel that features a female protagonist in that sport, which is really cool. And the two books on the right here, How to Be a Footballer and The Great Irish Book of Gaelic Games, again, that non-fiction side of things as well, that we can tap into, that sort of that thirst for knowledge and information. And if you have a student who is a fantastic reader but just does not is just not into novels, be they fantasy, comedy, whatever, maybe nonfiction is actually the way to go. And it can really obviously feed into their schoolwork as well, but can give them a real sense of being able to kind of curate their own learning, if that makes sense. So, graphic novels. I cannot recommend graphic novels enough, and I'll be talking at the end of the session in a while about manga. Graphic novels and comic books as well. I suppose Illegal by Owen Colfer and Andrew Duncan would be a sort of a crossover between the two. It's very comic booky, if that makes sense. I think sometimes adults kind of think that graphic novels and comic books are potentially not the best reading that a student or a young person can do. And I promise you that is just absolutely not the case. The kind of decoding the relationship between text and images in graphic novels and comic books is so sophisticated. It's a really, really intricate way of reading and of producing meaning. And sometimes I explain this to my students in Trinity as well, particularly with picture books and oftentimes with graphic novels, that you really are reading two things at the same time, and that sometimes the images can contradict the text and vice versa. Sometimes they support each other. Why does an artist, position a certain character in this place on the page? What are we supposed to be looking for here? What are the power dynamics happening? There's so much that goes on in reading a graphic novel that I can't recommend them highly enough, particularly again for students who are living maybe with the diagnosis of dyslexia, who can dive into a really immersive, really rich graphic novel, but that they might be able to read in half an hour. And they've done something really, really powerful for themselves there. And again, for students maybe who are struggling a little bit with their literacy, or for students who just, like I say, don't like those longer texts and maybe have a creative flair for art as well. So it kind of marries the two things. And I mean, even just the range that I have here, Nightlights by Lorena Alvarez, she's a South American author. It's a phenomenal sort of magical realism, again tapping into that South American tradition of that. And the main character is so creative, but she doesn't know how to express herself in school, ironically. And so that creativity kind of goes out into the wilderness, and of course there are consequences for this. Skip is a wonderful sort of surrealist journey. It takes place between multiple worlds actually, and two main characters who are kind of struggling to figure out who they are, and then going on a journey together then. And it's really one of the most unusual graphic novels I've ever come across. The Toyne up there at the top is a graphic novel retelling of the infamous Toyne story from the myth of Cuchulainn and the Wild Bull of Cooney. So like there are lots of different ways as well to sort of sneakily get curriculum information into these graphic novels as well. And again, they can be a really powerful way of introducing students to different cultures and to different narratives. Like Illegal, for instance, is it depicts the story of a refugee boy and how he sort of struggles to survive, essentially losing his family, trying to be reunited with his brother, just in a really accessible yet immersive and emotionally sort of mature and challenging way as well. And there's such a fabulous range of graphic novels available now, and again, particularly in libraries. The only caveat, of course, with graphic novels is that they tend to be more expensive because they tend to be hardback when they're produced. But again, your local library is the place to go. And again, sort of science, nonfiction. This is a huge expanse of nonfiction is being produced for young people now. And again, a couple of years ago, I would have struggled to fill this slide with something that wasn't the Guinness Book of Records or an encyclopedia of some description. So you have everything from sort of, memory superpowers, which really talks about good mental health as well, to climate change. I mean, Dara McNulty's Diary of a Young Naturalist is phenomenal and really sort of invites readers to immerse themselves in nature and to see the impact that they can have in the world around them. And The Summer We Turned Green by William Sutcliffe is the same. The Great Irish Science Book is fantastic by Luke O'Neill. So there's so many sort of niche non-fiction titles being produced now for young people, and especially with that idea of getting girls into science. Again, women in science, they're up at the top. So lots of different ways that, again, you can almost augment what's happening in the classroom and give students an outlet that they can take out of the classroom or out of the science lab, as the case may be. Now, history. And again, like I say, it's sort of a fine line between interests and subjects on these slides. But historical fiction for young people is, again, really burgeoning over the last couple of years. It's phenomenal. Now, these are very recent, but I mean, off the top of my head, I can think of Rosie's Troubles by Anne Carroll. I can think of The Guns of Easter by Jared Whelan. Irish authors seem to really excel in historical fiction. Sometimes it's by the time slip that, sort of a child, from contemporary times would end up back at a seminal moment in history and have to learn how to think on their feet almost. But we seem to have a particular graw for the past. Irish authors, certainly anyway, writing for children and young people. But this is a huge range of historical fiction titles that are available now. Alex Sweetle's Commotion of the Caribbean is phenomenal. Very sort of visceral in terms of the emotions portrayed. And I think it can be a wonderful way to, again, broaden that sort of empathy piece and invite students to really, really engage with the sort of the lived realities or the represented realities of history as well. And it can really make it come to life for them. Something like The Normans by John Farley is a little bit along the lines of Horrible Histories, which worryingly, I think celebrated its 30th birthday not too long ago, which is terrifying. But again, you can have that sort of humorous take on it as well. And everything from Black 47, which is the story of Ireland's Great Famine, and obviously quite heavy, to again something far more humorous like The Normans. So there's really an entry point for every kind of reader there, if that makes sense. Mythology. So I'm going to zero in on Loki quickly now before I get on to manga. But of course, because of the Marvel universe, mythology has become much more mainstream, I feel, in the last couple of years. So particularly somebody like Loki is now a recognizable figure, whereas before he was a very niche figure from Norse mythology. So an awful lot of authors are now reimagining old mythological tales. And again, Irish authors are particularly good at doing that. Some of them here that I have: Savage Her Reply by Deirdre Sullivan. That's a retelling of the Children of Lear from the point of view of Aoife, the supposed, sort of villain of the piece. And again, authors like Sullivan are doing really interesting things with viewpoints and with thinking about who's speaking and who's telling the story. So again, there's lots to be done there around that empathy and sort of perspective piece too. And again, immersing readers in different types of culture as well. So Girls Who Slay Monsters and Gods Don't Cry by Ellen Ryan are phenomenal sort of deep dives into Irish mythology too, where something like Jessie Burton, who's a UK author, Medusa, the girl behind the myth, again, those sort of feminist retellings, but not always feminist, but that sense of who is telling the story and really getting readers to think about that as well. And now the sort of the funny books. I suppose the humor side of things can be a really, really nice entry point for readers who, again, don't want maybe the heavy emotional content, but really just want a very good read. Like, for instance, Gwen and Art Are Not in Love is a retelling of Camelot, the Camelot story. But Gwen and Art are absolutely not in love with each other. And in fact, they have very, very complicated love lives outside of the relationship they're supposed to be having. So again, playing with old stories in a new way can be really, really interesting. Frankie's World by Aoife Dooley is fabulous. And again, it's about a sort of a character who's trying to find their way in the world and maybe not getting it right all of the time. Lumberjanes is a phenomenal LGBTQ plus story about a group of girls essentially living in a summer camp in the wilderness and getting up to all sorts of crazy things and meeting all sorts of weird and wonderful characters as well. Sisters of the Mist is the same. So those two are both graphic novels. And Kofi and the Rap Battle Summer is a phenomenal look at sort of nostalgic for some of us, but not obviously for teenagers at 90s London and the sort of trials and tribulations of growing up as a young Black boy in London. It's phenomenal. Yeah, I'm conscious, Eva, at the time, so I'm going to fly through. So we
I just
definitely
about to say that. We have
first of
12
all,
minutes left.
I want to have time to talk about manga and 100% have questions as well. So the sort of food culinary type, and again, you'll see Ajiba Daigadar up at the top again, is a lovely way to sort of draw in readers who are interested in that kind of like culinary creativity expression, but also say for something like Chinglish is very much about the culture behind the food. And again, I keep repeating myself, that empathy piece too. So it can be a lovely way to bring hobbies into reading. And the do's and donuts of love are just fantastic. It again, I defy a deeper jagger to write a book that's not infinitely readable. But again, this is sort of, there are so many different subgenres and subsections of young adult literature these days. And again, it's only in the last couple of years that this range is starting to blossom. So really and truly, there's a book out there for every reader, no matter what their interests or what their abilities. Books about music as well. Wink by Rob Harrell is fantastic. It's based on his own experience being diagnosed with cancer, but also discovering music as a form of expression and salvation almost as well. And again, you can have the sort of the nonfiction side of things, biographies, favorite musicians. There's so much there as well. And again, poetry and verse novels. So one by Sarah Crossan is a story of Siamese twins, conjoined twins, told in verse, and it's incredibly, incredibly immersive. But these are also short books. And again, I have Mice and Men from Barrington Stoke up at the top, and The Arrival by Sean Tan as a picture book. And even adaptations or abridged novels, something like Wuthering Heights, which is retold by Tanya Landman, that allows readers to access what is traditionally a very off-putting narrative. Everybody in Wuthering Heights is horrible, but the way that Tanya Landman retells it just makes it really accessible for a new audience. And now, we will finish on Manga Aoife, I promise, and then we have time for questions. But I've gone to town, as people can see a little bit. I could have potentially fit in even more mangas. But I've come to realize recently, myself and Eve have been talking about this, that manga is actually an excellent way of getting probably young teenage boys, most specifically, into reading. Anime has become far more mainstream even in the last sort of 5 to 10 years than it was, certainly when I was growing up. And if you know that students in your school have an interest in anime, the manga is the natural sort of next step. So something like Detective Conan has been running for over 1,000 episodes in its anime form, but the manga is fantastic as well. There are so many sports mangas as well, that from sort of basketball to baseball to volleyball, content that's not actually available in Western sort of mainstream literature for young adults as well. And then you have sort of really inventive, again, magical realism like Hunter x Hunter or Jujutsu Kaisen. And I mean, these are really immersive, well crafted, beautifully produced, emotionally mature narratives, particularly something like Fruits Basket, which is really an exploration of mental well-being, of connection, of family, of found family as well. And something like Pluto, which is just an incredibly original story that will literally hook you from the first page. And again, the caveat with manga is that it can be expensive. They're usually across multiple volumes, but again, e-readers can be the way to go with this, and also the local library too. But again, if you find that just nothing has worked with particular students, maybe just ask them if they're into anime, and if they are, manga could be the thing that actually gets them reading. And that's it. So do I will stop sharing, Aoife, and we will see what questions we have. And what time is it? Oh, we have 8 whole minutes for questions, Aoife. I'm so good.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Becky. It was really interesting to see that Manga Slide had way more choices on it. It was like you just couldn't choose between your favorites.
So
We had one, it was a comment in the chat.
great.
I'm sure you'd be really happy to see. The Darkest Rising is my favorite children's book, and the film was dreadful. Angela.
Angela, we are of two minds on this.
Yeah.
I love it.
Me too. So disappointed in the film, especially because I actually love Christopher Eccleston as well. When he was in it.
Same. Oh my goodness, I was so disappointed. But then it just goes to show that you can have the ultimate magic mix, and it just doesn't, like, the pancake just doesn't turn out well at all. But again, like, I think that is a handy teachable thing, as in, if you have a great film adaptation, like Pride and Prejudice, for instance, great. You're like, this is really successful. Why does it work? But then if you have something awful, you could pull it apart and be like, why is the book so much better? So that comparison piece is really, really interesting.
We had student selection workshops in some secondary schools recently, and a lot of them have chosen classics and books that were obviously adaptations. And that's why they've chosen them, because they have seen them and they do want to watch them.
Yeah, it's
Have
phenomenal.
we any other questions, Tracy or Angela? Anything you'd like to ask our resident expert, Becky?
And lads, I know I flew through the slides towards the end, but Aoife will be sending them on, so like you'll have all the recommendations. And again, lots of stuff on our website as well. But I really wanted to get to the manga, so apologies for that.
Suppose it's just how, like, I'm coming to this from a parent kind of point of view, and as a big book reader myself, I just find it hard to get the kids. Like, I buy books, I leave them around, and I try and look for ones that they might be interested in. But I think because it's coming from me, there's no interest. You know what I mean? Like, if it was
Yeah.
like a kind of, I might try and go down the TikTok route and try and get them to look into TikTok kind of people who recommend books rather than myself trying to recommend books.
Do you know, and I think it is that sort of, you don't want to, be encouraging them to be on social media. But again, if they're already there, why not have them do something like that? Like tap into a community of readers that's there. And, and people are very opinionated on TikTok and Twitter. So they can, they can kind of see, oh, this person particularly likes this type of book and this person doesn't. And it might actually help them figure out what kind of reader they are as well. So yeah, it feels a bit counterintuitive, but actually engaging with social media could make them into more interested readers. Tracy, I see you're talking about suggestions for sort of older readers in 17, 18. And again, not to harp on about manga, but I will for a minute. The manga market is incredibly sort of nuanced, as in there's a lot of content that's aimed at sort of like younger boys. So shall we say like 10 to kind of 14, and the same with girls. So there's specific kind of categories, but there are some phenomenal mangas that are really aimed at older readers, exactly as you were saying, sort of 17, 18, and they're very sort of, they're excellent at kind of emotional content. And it's almost like slice of life, kind of contemporary stuff. So I would encourage you to look at manga, maybe for readers who are kind of reluctant. But I suppose for 17 to 18-year-olds, I would very much recommend, if you have a book that you're reading yourself, to talk to them about that. Now, I know Angela was saying that sort of that doesn't go down very well, but I mean, sort of like crime novels, thrillers, that kind of thing. Just teenagers seem to be just so into them. Like I was saying about Karen M. McManus, those kinds of books, that they're really engaging, yes, and they are well written, but it's that fast-paced kind of thriller thing. And you will find believable characters, but it's not really about the characters. Oh yes, Amy, that's phenomenal. What walks these halls? It's so creepy. Like I can handle horror better in books than I can in movies, but like it is particularly sort of spine tingling. And also, if you come across say somebody like Deirdre Sullivan, Savage Her Reply. Deirdre Sullivan has some wonderful sort of older teenage books as well, and particularly something like Needlework. And again, sort of like really emotionally visceral, I would almost say, but like phenomenal characters, really wonderful writing as well. And I suppose it's kind of maybe supporting those sort of older readers to find out what they like to read. I suppose at that kind of age, they've kind of figured out, sort of that maybe they don't like fantasy, maybe they hate sports books, but they really, really love comedies or thrillers or that kind of thing. So I suppose it's their reading ability, it should be okay at that stage, and it's about sort of supporting them to find the content. Because it's very tough. The young adult market, it gets very blurred towards the sort of the higher end of the age range. And, young adult very quickly becomes adult content too. And that's something that of course, you have to be wary of. But then at that stage, their agency and autonomy is a huge part of why they read, because they pick something up and they really want to read it. I think particularly for boys, something like it fantasy can be kind of a little bit off-putting for some readers, because they think it's all sort of, spells and wizards and dragons and Harry Potter. But there are some really, really inventive sort of young adult fantasy writers who will take kind of again, mythology and rework it. So I'm reading something at the minute called The First Binding, and it's I would happily recommend it to anyone who's sort of that 17, 18. It's a story about stories. R.J. Vinder, I think is see, this is awful. I'm so engrossed in the book, I've actually forgotten the name of the author, but The First Binding. So something fantasy wise, or again, biographies. If you have a 17 or 18-year-old who has a favorite musician or a favorite pop star, sports star, that kind of thing, biographies are a fantastic way to get them engaged and engrossed in reading. Because obviously, like if you have a favorite musician or pop star, whatever, you want to know more about them. And that kind of biography writing can be a really interesting way to get them back into it, if that makes sense, if you're trying to really encourage them. But graphic novels as well. Something like Owen Colfer's work, like I say, Illegal and Global, are really kind of tackling the things I think the teenagers are and young adults are kind of concerned and worried about, as in, you know, the experience of their peers who've been displaced, who've become refugees, and climate change as well. So I suppose figuring out what your teenager or your young person is passionate about and helping them figure out where they can go to find stories that will empower them, hopefully, and inform them as well, but really kind of let them know that they're not alone. It's that idea of, like, you know, we read to know we're not alone, so that they can find narratives that they empathize with, but that also kind of open up the world to them a bit, if that makes sense. Oh, and also anything by Neil Gaiman. Sorry, I knew there was somebody else that I wanted to mention. Anything by Neil Gaiman. He just has this ability to sort of write across ages. I'd highly recommend anything by him.
We also have our themed reading lists on the website. So there was kind of a specific thing that the student was really interested in. And then this is an old reading guide now, but in our reading guides, we'd always have a read also here at the bottom. So if there's a title that they really like in that, there will be that read also. That will be something in a similar enough
The
vein.
read alsos, when I was editing the reading guide, they were a gigantic pain, but also really satisfying to find as well. So yeah, like if there's a particular book that you know they'll love, there'll also be an extra suggestion added onto that. We also have a literally particular reading list that says, if you've read this, you should read that. So lots and lots of stuff on the website as well, and you can search by sort of theme or genre as well. So if you already know at least that much, you'll get lots and lots of ideas then. Like obviously for individual readers, but maybe potentially for class novels as well.
Any other questions?
Oh, you're so welcome, Tracy. And look, like I say, Aoife will be sharing the slides, but if you have any other questions and you want maybe something more detailed, if you have like a particular student or a particular class in mind, pop Aoife an email and I can see what I can do in terms of a reading prescription, if that makes sense.
Thank you. It's really enjoyable.
You're so welcome.
Informative.
As I say, any excuse for me to talk about manga is a joy.
Okay, so we won't keep you any longer. Thank you, Tracy, Angela, and Mairead, for joining us. I'm going to